His hands were still dripping with blood when he realized he couldn't breathe without thinking of her. In the empty hall, where the last body had been removed, only the scent of gunpowder remained, along with the sound of his own conscience crumbling. It had begun with a glance that lasted a second too long. Now it was too late to turn back. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. In the halls of the Empire, where every word had a price and every silence hid a blade, she was what no one saw. The girl from the archives, the shadow who served coffee in white porcelain cups, always with her head down, always with steps that made no sound. In the background of official photographs, when she appeared, she was just a blurry smudge, a faceless presence. The world around her moved in closed deals with firm handshakes and whispered threats, but no one noticed the young woman with the restrained gaze who noted everything, who saw everything, who understood more than she should. To the men of the Empire, she was furniture, part of the structure, as forgettable as the wallpaper or the sound of their own footsteps on the cold marble. They discussed murders while she organized documents. They planned betrayals while she served whiskey. They divided territories while she emptied cigar ashes into silver ashtrays. And she absorbed every word, every name, every veiled threat, without ever raising her eyes or showing that she understood the language of death. She had learned to be invisible even before arriving there. In her impoverished childhood, in the hallways of orphanages, in the homes where she had served as a maid, the lesson was always the same. Those who are seen too much become targets. Survival demanded fading out, blending into the landscape, existing without occupying space. And she had mastered this art perfectly. Her face carried no striking features. Her voice never rose above what was necessary. Her clothes were always the same neutral color, a gray that blended with the walls, with the dust, with oblivion. But there was something no one saw. Behind her downcast eyes, there was a sharp mind that cataloged information, traced connections, understood the invisible threads that moved the Empire. She knew who owed whom, who had betrayed whom, which alliances were genuine and which were just temporary truces before the next massacre. And she kept all this in silence, like someone guarding secrets that could kill. He rarely looked at the faces below him. The mob boss, the man whose word could alter the fate of entire neighborhoods, whose name was not pronounced without a pause of respect or fear. His empire stretched like an invisible net over the city, controlling everything from the docks to the judges, from politicians to the police. Loyalty was his most valuable currency, fear his universal language, betrayal his only unforgivable heresy. He had built that with his own hands, starting as an enforcer on the grimy streets, climbing step by step through calculated violence and brutal intelligence. There was no room for feelings on that path. Love was weakness. Compassion was vulnerability. Everyone around him served a specific function, replaceable like parts of a machine. He had learned early that trusting too much was dying slowly. His routine was precise as ancient rituals. He woke before dawn, reviewed reports, made decisions that altered lives without ever knowing the faces affected. Meetings happened at the same times, in the same hall, with the same men in dark suits and empty gazes. Coffee was always served in the same cup, at the same temperature. Everything was control. Everything was predictability. Everything was power manifested through absolute order. And yet, in recent months, something had begun to change. A slight uneasiness, almost imperceptible, that bothered him during sleepless nights. They were small details. A desk arranged with unusual perfection, a document saved from an error that could have cost lives. The discreet echo of a feminine voice that never contradicted him, but somehow was always present at the right moments. He couldn't name the discomfort. It was like a stone in his shoe that he couldn't find, a distant sound he couldn't identify. Then came the moment that would crack everything. A meeting delayed by last-minute problems, tension in the air. One of the advisors had brought bad news about an operation at the docks. Everyone was nervous, measuring every word. He was standing by the window, watching the city below, when he made a careless gesture with his hand and knocked over his coffee cup onto important documents. The dark liquid spread quickly across the paper, erasing names, staining contracts that had cost months of negotiation. There was a heavy silence. No one moved. No one dared to point out his error. That's when she appeared, as always, from nowhere, materialized from thin air. She brought clean cloths, collected the papers, began to dry the table with precise and rapid movements. She said nothing. She looked at no one. She simply performed her function. But when her fingers touched the wet documents, she paused for a fraction of a second, and her eyes lifted. Just an instant. Just a quick glance to check if the most important names were still legible. And he saw. In that second that lasted beyond what was necessary, he really saw her. Not the invisible employee, but the person. There was intelligence in those eyes. There was understanding. She understood what was written there. She understood the weight of those names. She understood the disaster that spilled coffee could have caused. And more, there was a certain firmness in the way she held the moment, a discreet courage of someone who knows the value of her own silence. He blinked. When he refocused, she had already finished cleaning and was exiting through the side door, disappearing as she always disappeared. But something had broken in his perception. For the first time in years, the mob boss had shifted his attention from external problems and fixed it on someone, internal. And this deeply unsettled him. From that day on, the empire began to move around in absence. He started looking for her with his gaze, even without consciously realizing it. When he entered the hall, his eyes swept the room until he located her in the corner, organizing papers or preparing coffee. When she wasn't present, a strange discomfort invaded him, as if something essential was missing. It was ridiculous. It was unacceptable. It was dangerous. He began to notice details he had completely ignored before. The way she tied her hair in a simple bun, always with the same silver hairpins. The way her fingers organized documents by order of importance without anyone having taught her the system. The silent way she moved, as if she had learned not to exist to survive. And this bothered him. Why? Why would someone so capable choose to be so invisible? He tried to ignore it. He drowned himself in work, in negotiations, in necessary executions. But the uneasiness grew. It was as if, by truly seeing her for the first time, he had opened a door he could no longer close. And worse, he began to notice when she wasn't there. Her absence gained form, weight, presence. The coffee served by someone else didn't taste the same. The documents organized by other hands were never in the right order. The men closest to him began to notice. Mark, his right-hand man, was the first to comment. One night, after a particularly tense meeting, he stayed behind when everyone was leaving. "Boss," he said carefully, "you've been distracted lately." Distracted? His voice came out cold, cutting. "Different then." Mark chose the word cautiously. "Ever since that problem at the docks, you've seemed absent. The men are noticing." He didn't answer immediately. He poured himself whiskey, watched the amber liquid against the light. He knew Mark was right. He knew he was losing focus, but he couldn't name why. Or worse, he knew but couldn't admit it. "The men should worry about their own problems," he said finally. "It's just that—" Mark hesitated. "Some comments have been surfacing. Nothing serious yet, but you know how it is. This world doesn't forgive distractions." The implicit threat hung in the air. In the Empire, weakness was a death sentence, and the boss who showed any vulnerability quickly became a former boss. Everyone knew that rule. He himself had applied it to the man who had held the position before him. But Mark's warning, instead of frightening him, only intensified his uneasiness, because he knew deep down that the distraction had a name. It had a face he hadn't seen before. It had fingers that organized papers and eyes that understood secrets. And then came the error that would change everything. A routine operation, delivery of goods at the pier, payment to corrupt police officers, transfer of territories. Simple, direct. It had been executed dozens of times without problems. But this time, something failed. A contact was eliminated without prior authorization. A police officer who should have been paid ended up dead in an alley. The order hadn't come from him. Someone had acted on their own. The internal investigation began immediately. All involved were interrogated, records were reviewed, and the error was traced back to a mix-up in the archives. Poorly organized documents that led to the wrong information reaching the wrong hands. She was called to his office. It was the first time they had been alone in a closed room. She entered with her usual posture, head slightly down, hands clasped in front of her body, silent presence. But there was something different in the air, a tension that hadn't existed before. He was sitting behind the enormous mahogany desk, and she remained standing on the other side, waiting. "The archives were wrong," he said, without mincing words. "Yes, sir." Her voice was low but firm. "How did this happen?" She raised her eyes for the second time. And again, in that look, there was something that completely unnerved him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was a terrifying clarity, like someone who knows truths that no one else sees. "The cataloging system was changed 2 weeks ago," she said calmly. "I requested authorization to correct it, but I was ignored. The error was predictable." Silence. She had held his gaze. She had spoken the truth without flinching. She had, subtly but undeniably, pointed out that the fault was not hers, but of those who had not listened to her. In the Empire, no one confronted the boss. No one dared to contradict him, even indirectly. But she had done exactly that, and she had done it with a calm that suggested she did not fear the abyss. Something inside him stirred, something dangerous and uncontrollable. He should punish her for her insolence. It was what everyone expected. It was what held the Empire together. Immediate consequences for any deviation. But he couldn't, because she was right. And more importantly, she had had the courage to say it. "Get out," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. She gave a slight bow of her head and withdrew. When the door closed, he realized he was holding his breath. The change in the men was subtle but perceptible. Comments arose in the hallways, the kind of rumor that weakens a reputation more than an outright betrayal. "He's different. He's distracted. He's getting soft." The advisors began exchanging glances during meetings. His decisions were questioned more frequently. The absolute authority he had always wielded began to crack, millimeter by millimeter. And she, unknowingly, had become the invisible epicenter of that imbalance, because he couldn't stop thinking about her. He couldn't stop looking for her in the corners of the hall, noticing when she wasn't present, remembering the way she had held his gaze without fear. It was absurd. It was unthinkable. He, who had always considered feelings as dangerous luxuries, was being corroded by something he couldn't name or control. He tried to distance her. He ordered others to take over her duties in the main halls. He tried simply not to see her, not to think about her, not to allow that insignificant presence to occupy so much space in his mind. But her absence was worse than her presence. It was like tearing a part of himself away. And he didn't understand why, until the external threat materialized. On a rainy night, 2 men intercepted her on the street. She was returning to the small boarding house where she lived in the working-class neighborhood when her path was blocked. One of them was known to her. He had appeared a few times in the office, one of the mid-level enforcers. The other was a stranger with scars on his face and unblinking eyes. "We need to talk to you," the known man said. She felt a cold fear run down her spine, but kept her voice steady. "About what?" "About loyalty." He took a step forward. "Does the boss trust you? I do my job. But do you just do your job?" The man smiled, but there was no humor there. "Are you doing other things? Things that make the boss distracted?" She understood immediately. They thought she was some kind of threat. Or worse, they thought she was seducing the boss, weakening him on purpose. It was an accusation that, in that world, had only one sentence. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Are you sure?" The second man spoke for the first time, his voice rough like metal scraping metal. "Because we've heard some things, and when the boss starts to get soft because of a woman, we need to do a loyalty test." What happened in the following minutes was a mixture of terror and survival instinct. They didn't physically harm her, not yet, but they made it clear they were watching, that any wrong move would be her last, that she was, from that moment on, a problem to be solved. When they finally let her go, she ran the 3 blocks to the boarding house, locked herself in her tiny room, and collapsed against the door. Her hands trembled, her heart beat erratically, and for the first time in years, she cried, but not for the men who had threatened her. She cried because she finally understood. She had made the fatal mistake of becoming visible, and in that world, Visibility was a death sentence. News reached the boss 3 hours later through a network of informants he maintained even among his own men. Someone loyal enough to know that this was information he needed to know immediately. When he heard, something inside him broke. It wasn't immediate anger, it was worse. It was panic, a visceral and absolute fear he hadn't felt since childhood, when he was still vulnerable, when he could still be hurt. The thought that something might have happened to her, that brutal hands might have touched her, that she might have disappeared before him. Before him what? Before he had the chance to understand what she meant? For the first time in his adult life, he acted without calculating consequences. He canceled important deals, convened emergency meetings in the middle of the night, demanded to know who had given the order, who had dared to touch someone that he what? Protected, valued, loved. The word hit him like a shot. Love. Was that it? Was this the weakness that corroded him? Love for a woman he barely knew, who had barely spoken to him, who existed as a shadow on the margins of his life. But he couldn't deny it. The fear of losing her was too real, too intense, too devastating to be anything else. He summoned the 2 men who had approached her. The meeting took place in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, where the smell of mold mixed with old blood. Mark was present, as were 3 other advisors. Everyone felt that something was wrong, that the boss was not acting as he always had. The 2 enforcers arrived confident. They thought they had done the right thing, identifying a potential threat. When they entered and saw the expressions around them, their confidence began to waver. "You touched her," he said. It wasn't a question. The known man hesitated. "Boss, you laid a finger on her?" No. We just talked. Just asked some routine questions. Protection, you know. We thought that... You thought." He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. "You thought you had authorization to decide who is a threat within my empire?" Tense silence. "You thought you could make decisions about who lives and who dies without my direct order?" "We were protecting your interests, boss. She was making you. Different. The men are talking..." The gun appeared so fast that no one had time to process it. 1 shot, 2. The bodies fell with dry thuds against the concrete. Blood began to spread slowly, forming dark puddles that reflected the faint ceiling lights. Mark and the other advisors were paralyzed. This wasn't a calculated execution. It was pure emotion. It was a man acting on impulse, not strategy. It was the worst thing that could happen. "Does anyone else want to make decisions for me?" His voice echoed in the empty space. No one answered. "Does anyone else want to question who I protect or why?" Absolute silence. He left the warehouse without looking back, leaving the bodies for others to deal with. But everyone there knew something fundamental had changed. The empire, built on fear and rational control, now had a crack. And cracks in that world always widened until they swallowed everything. She learned of the execution the next morning. Rumors spread quickly among low-level employees, whispers in the service corridors. 2 men dead. Direct order from the boss. Because of her, the terror she felt was different from the fear of the night before. It was worse, because it wasn't just about her own life now. It was about what her existence was doing to him, to the empire, to the order of things. She had become the catalyst of a destruction she couldn't control. She tried to disappear again, returned to old habits of maximum invisibility. Didn't raise her eyes, didn't speak unless absolutely necessary, moved like a ghost, desperately trying to erase herself from everyone's perception. But it was too late. She had already been seen. And once someone is truly seen, there's no going back to being a shadow. The Empire reacted. Not immediately, not with obvious violence, but with the kind of silent movement that preceded major changes. Advisors began meeting without his presence. Conversations were interrupted when he entered. Glances were exchanged behind his back. Loyalty, which had always been absolute, began to become conditional. Mark was the one who finally confronted him. One night, when it was just the 2 of them in the office, late, with the city sleeping outside. "You're making a mistake," Mark said bluntly. He looked up from the documents. "Be careful." "No, boss, you need to hear this. You're making a mistake that will destroy everything we've built. I executed 2 men who acted without authorization. Where's the mistake? The mistake wasn't executing them. It was the reason. Mark leaned over the desk. We all know why you killed them. For her, for the archive girl, and that is weakness. The word hung between them, heavy and dangerous. In this world, boss, no face is indispensable. You taught me that yourself, remember? When you took over, you killed the previous boss's mistress because she was a distraction. That was the rule. Whoever causes distraction is eliminated. And now you're breaking your own rule. He didn't answer immediately because Mark was right. Absolutely right. That was the fundamental rule. He had always believed in it, always applied it without hesitation. But something inside him refused to accept. Something stronger than logic or strategy. She's not a distraction, he said finally. She's... What? What is she, boss? He had no answer. Or he did, but couldn't say it aloud. Because saying it would make it too real, too vulnerable. Mark sighed. The advisors are restless, the men are talking, and you know how it works. When the king shows weakness, pretenders to the throne appear. You need to resolve this. Now. Resolve? You know what you need to do. The implication was clear. Eliminate the source of weakness. Eliminate her. Restore balance. Prove he was still the same man he had always been. He should have agreed. Should have given the order right there. It was the correct decision, the only possible decision for someone who wanted to maintain power. But he couldn't. The words wouldn't come out, and Mark saw it in his eyes. You've already lost her, Mark said softly. You've already lost control. The only question now is whether you'll lose the Empire too. When Mark left, he was alone in the office, with the city outside and a heavy silence within him. He knew Mark was right. He knew he was moving towards an abyss. But he couldn't stop, because for the first time in his life, something mattered more than power. And that terrified him. The following weeks were of escalating tension. He ordered protection for her, discreet but constant. Trusted men followed her from a distance, ensuring no one approached her again. He removed anyone from the inner circle who showed signs of doubt about his authority. He intervened in small matters he would previously ignore, just to maintain control. Every act of defense seemed like an affront to the structure he himself had created. Every decision based on protecting her undermined the cold logic that had always governed the Empire, and the men noticed. The cracks widened. Meanwhile, she perceived his transformation with a mixture of fear and something she dared not name. She knew that the gesture of being protected came at a high cost. She knew he was being watched, questioned, threatened. She saw a silent war in his eyes, the man against the boss, instinct against reason, the desire to protect against the need to govern. They didn't speak. They barely crossed paths anymore, because he had ordered her to work in a separate office, away from the main halls, where she would be safer. But the absence of physical contact only intensified the emotional presence. He thought of her constantly. She dreamed of him every night, and the Empire, like a living organism, felt the change in its leader's breath. The twists and turns came in rapid succession. First, an ambush at the docks. Shipment intercepted, 3 men dead. Intelligence indicated it was an internal leak of information. Someone within the structure was passing data to rival factions. Then, a name betrayed on a list. A politician who was on the payroll appeared dead with 3 shots to the head. The message was clear. Secrets were no longer safe. The protection the Empire offered was no longer absolute. Then, an informant disappeared. Simply vanished, without a trace. He was one of the most reliable, someone who provided crucial information about police movements. His disappearance left an enormous operational void. With each new threat, it became clear that the true target was not the Empire itself, but his authority specifically. Someone was testing his capacity to respond. Someone was gauging whether he still had absolute control. And worse, someone was sending the message that they knew exactly what his new weakness was. In a tense meeting with all the advisors, Mark presented the evidence. "It's a coordinated campaign," he said, spreading photographs and reports on the table. "Someone is trying to destabilize your position, and we know why." All eyes turned to him, waiting. They know you're vulnerable. They know there's something, someone, you wouldn't sacrifice even for the sake of the Empire, and they're using that against you. Who are they? His voice was controlled, but everyone felt the underlying tension. Internal factions who think you're weak, and some external factions who have always wanted your territory. The difference is that now they have an opening. You've shown you can be shaken. And in a world like ours, that's all they needed. Heavy silence. The solution is obvious, Mark continued. You need to make a public demonstration that you're still the same man. You need to prove that there's nothing, no one, that can shake your authority. You need to. He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Everyone there knew what wasn't being said. He needed to sacrifice her, publicly, brutally, to restore the balance of fear. The advisors began to murmur approval. It was the logical solution, the only solution. The Empire demanded blood, a demonstration that the boss was still capable of putting power above everything else. She would be the perfect example. The woman who almost destroyed an empire, eliminated by the very hand of the one who tried to protect her. But he couldn't. Just thinking about it made something tear inside him. Seeing that meeting, hearing those men casually discussing her murder as if it were any logistical problem, awakened in him a fury he didn't know he could still feel. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Boss, get out." Everyone stood up quickly. Mark was the last stopping at the door. "You have until the end of the week to decide. After that, the men will decide for you." The threat was clear. Either he restored balance, or there would be an internal coup. The Empire wouldn't wait indefinitely. When he was alone, he dropped his head into his hands. For the first time in decades, he felt completely lost. All the skills that had brought him there, the coldness, the calculation, the ability to make impossible choices without hesitation, seemed to have evaporated. In their place, only the man remained. Frightened, desperate, in love. And then he made a decision. If he couldn't kill her to save the Empire, he would destroy the Empire to save her. What followed was a series of moves that, from the outside, seemed erratic, but had a desperate internal logic. He began to transfer key people to distant positions, deleted sensitive records from the main archives, moved money to secret accounts, built escape networks that even Mark didn't know about, and he prepared a fake identity for her. Documents, passport, fabricated story. Everything she would need to disappear completely, start over somewhere else, far from that world of violence and shadows. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was the only thing he could do. Try to save her, even if it cost everything he had built. He thus became exactly what he had always despised, a vulnerable, weak man governed by feeling instead of reason, a traitor to his own system, a king who chose a commoner instead of the kingdom. Mark discovered his moves. Not everything, but enough to understand what was happening. And when he confronted the boss again, there was genuine sadness in his eyes. "You're really going to do this," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. "You're going to throw everything away. Everything we built. Everything you are. Yes." Mark shook his head. "I can't understand. She's just a woman. A person. How can she be worth more than an entire empire?" He looked at the man who had been his right-hand man for years. "Because for the first time in my life, Mark, I feel like I'm doing something that truly matters. Everything else. It was just survival, power, fear. But she made me remember that I'm still human. Being human in this world is to die. Then so be it." Mark left without saying anything else. Both knew that things had reached the point of no return. Tension grew like a night tide, inexorable and suffocating. The Empire, feeling that its leader no longer commanded them with the same authority, began to move on its own. Old alliances dissolved. New agreements were made without consultation. Loyalty that was once absolute was now conditional, transactional, temporary. The halls that once revered him now watched him with calculation and doubt. They realized he had gone too far to retreat, but not far enough to have the courage to break completely. And she felt all this. In sleepless nights, when the silence of the boarding house became unbearable, she carried the weight of guilt for everything he was risking. She wanted to disappear again, return to absolute invisibility, but it was too late. The Empire now saw her as an existential threat. And the man who commanded it was willing to face all others to keep her alive. She hadn't asked for this. She had never wanted to be seen. But now that she was, she couldn't undo it. She could only watch as the world crumbled around them. The final confrontation began on a Thursday night, a meeting called by Mark without his authorization. All advisors present, all internal factions represented. When he arrived in the hall, he immediately realized something was wrong. The men's positions, the tension in the air, the avoided glances. Everything indicated that this was not a common meeting. It was a trial. "Sit down," Mark said, assuming a position of authority he had never had before. He didn't sit down. He stood, his back to the window, hands in his pockets. Calm externally, but every muscle tense. "We've decided it's time to have an honest conversation," Mark continued, "about the future of the Empire, about leadership, about priorities." "We decided?" He let the pronoun hang. "Who is we?" "All of us." Mark made a sweeping gesture. "All the men who built this with you, who bled for it, who killed for it, and who now see everything crumbling because the leader is compromised." Compromised. Yes, by a woman who holds no importance in the grand scheme of things. And this needs to end. Today. The ultimatum was laid out. Either he made the right decision, eliminate her, or they would make the decision for him. And in the process, they would probably eliminate him too. He looked around the hall. He saw men he had known for years. Some had fought by his side on the streets. Others he himself had promoted. All now looked at him with a mixture of residual respect and cold determination. The Empire was greater than any individual, even the leader. That was the rule. And rules in that world were absolute. "You're giving me an ultimatum," he said softly. "We're giving you a chance," Mark corrected. "A chance to do the right thing, to remember who you are, to save what you've built." And if I refuse? Silence. The answer was implicit. Then he would cease to be the leader, and he would probably cease to breathe as well. He should have felt fear. He should have backed down. He should have chosen survival, as he always had. But something had fundamentally changed within him. The man who entered that hall was no longer the same man who had built the Empire. "Then I refuse," he said. Shock swept through the room like a wave. "I refuse to accept that you decide for me. I refuse to accept that the Empire is worth more than a life. I refuse to continue being the man I've always been. And if that means losing everything, then so be it." Mark closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, there was genuine sorrow there. "You're choosing to die for her. I'm choosing to live for her. For the first time, I'm choosing to truly live." What happened in the following minutes was chaotic. Heated discussions, men standing up, weapons being drawn. But he remained in the same place, calm, accepting any outcome. Because for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't afraid of death. He was only afraid of not having saved her. In the end, it was Mark who prevented the massacre. He raised his hand, asking for calm. He looked at the man who had been his boss and, in some strange way, his friend. "You have 24 hours, he said. "Take her and disappear. After that, both of you are targets. We're coming after you and we won't stop until you're dead. But you have a day's head start, out of respect for everything you were." It was the only mercy he could offer. And both knew it was more than he deserved. He nodded once, left the hall, and never returned. He went straight to the boarding house where she lived. He knocked on the door in the middle of the night. When she opened it, eyes wide with surprise and fear, he saw in her everything he was leaving behind, and everything worth dying for. "We need to go," he said. "Now." She didn't ask questions. She saw in his eyes that something fundamental had changed, that the world they knew had ended. She grabbed only a small backpack with some clothes and documents. In 10 minutes, they were on the street, walking fast towards a car he kept hidden for emergencies. "What happened?" she asked when they were inside the vehicle, him driving at high speed through the deserted streets. "I chose you," he said simply. She processed the words, their weight, all their implications. The Empire. It's over. For me, at least. I don't command anything anymore. I have no more power. I'm just a man running away with the woman he loves. It was the first time he had said it aloud. The word love, finally named, finally real. She felt tears burn her eyes, but they didn't fall. There was something greater than sadness or joy there. It was an awareness of the cost, of the sacrifice, of the magnitude of what he had done. "You destroyed everything for me," she whispered. "I saved everything through you," he corrected. They drove through the night, without a certain destination, just away, to anywhere they could start over. He had money hidden, he had false identities, he had vague plans to cross borders, disappear completely, but both knew the truth. The Empire did not forgive. Mark had given them 24 hours, but then hunters would come, and hunters always found their prey. It didn't matter, because for the first time in both their lives, they were free. Free from the weight of invisibility, free from the weight of power, free to be just two ordinary people running together towards an uncertain future. In the following weeks, they moved like ghosts, changing cities every few days, using different names, avoiding cameras, paying for everything in cash. She wore wigs. He shaved his beard, let his hair grow out. They became other people. And in this process of disappearing, something strange happened. They began to truly get to know each other. Without the Empire between them, without the hierarchy, without the fear, just two human beings discovering each other in cheap hotels and roadside diners. She talked about her childhood in the orphanages. He talked about the streets that shaped him. She laughed, and he discovered he had never seen her laugh. He cried, and she discovered that powerful men could also break. They made love for the first time in a motel room in a town whose name they couldn't remember. It was clumsy and unexpected and absolutely perfect, because it wasn't about power or possession. It was about two people finding tenderness amidst the chaos. "Do you really love me?" she asked later, lying beside him in the darkness. "More than I thought possible to love anything." "Why? I was never special, never beautiful, never anything but nothing." He turned to face her. "You were everything I didn't know I was looking for. You showed me that there was still humanity in me, that I didn't have to be just the monster, and that's worth more than any empire." She touched his face, feeling the stubble, the signs of fatigue. "And now? Are we going to run forever?" "Probably, or until they find us." "And when they find us? Then at least I'll die knowing I lived, truly." But the Empire didn't send hunters, at least not immediately, because something unexpected happened. With his abrupt departure, the power vacuum resulted in internal war. The factions that united against him now turned against each other. Mark tried to take control, but he didn't have his natural authority. Other advisors rebelled. The empire that seemed so solid began to implode under its own weight. They watched everything from afar, through sparse news and rumors that arrived via indirect channels. They saw the chaos spread. They saw territories being divided. They saw the power he had built disintegrate in a matter of weeks. "Do you regret it?" she asked one night as they watched the news about a gang war that had erupted in the city. He thought for a long moment. "No, because I finally understood something. Power is nothing if you're alone, and I was always alone, even surrounded by people. But with you, I'm complete." Still, the shadow of the threat never completely left them. They always looked over their shoulders, always checked if they weren't being followed. Fear was a constant companion, even in moments of peace. 6 months after their escape, when they were temporarily settled in a small coastal town, the past finally caught up with them. It was she who noticed first, a man observing from across the street, another in the diner where they were having breakfast, subtle signs that someone without her training in invisibility wouldn't have noticed. "They found us," she said softly. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, like someone who had always known that day would come. "We have to go now." But when they stood to leave, other men blocked the exits. 6 of them, armed, professionals. The Empire had sent its best. There was nowhere to run. The leader of the group, an older man he recognized vaguely, approached. "Mark sent a message," he said. "You were right about one thing. The Empire didn't survive without you. It's in pieces now, war everywhere. chaos, and that's your fault. I know, but Mark wants you to know something else. The man paused. He wants you to know you made the right choice. Confusion. He didn't expect those words. Mark took over what was left and is trying to rebuild, but it's decades of work. And in the midst of it all, he started to understand that maybe there are things more important than power. That maybe you weren't weak. Maybe you were the only one strong enough to choose differently. The man took a step back. He won't send anyone else after you. Not because he forgave you, but because he realized you've already paid the price, and that the Empire didn't deserve a man capable of loving like that. Absolute silence. You're free. For real this time. The Empire has released you. And then, as quickly as they appeared, the men were gone, leaving them there, in the small diner, trembling with relief and shock. She held his hand. Is it real? I think so. Are we free? We're free. She started to cry then, not from sadness, but from liberation. All the weight of the past months, all the fear, all the tension, it all drained away through her tears. And he held her, feeling the same immense relief course through his own body. They were free, truly free. The Empire had released them, and they could, finally, begin to live. In the months and years that followed, they built a life. Simple, ordinary, far from anything that reminded them of the past. He worked in construction, using his hands to create instead of destroy. She opened a small bookstore, surrounded by words and stories that had nothing to do with violence. They married in a discreet ceremony on a deserted beach. No witnesses, just the sea and the sky. He promised never again to be the man he had been. She promised never again to hide, and both promises were kept. They had a daughter, small, with big eyes and an easy laugh. When she was born and he held her for the first time, he felt an emotion he had never experienced. Pure hope. That child would never know about the Empire, never live in the shadows. She would grow up free, loved, seen. Sometimes, on quiet nights when their daughter slept, they talked about the past, about what they left behind, about the price they paid. And they always came to the same conclusion. It was worth it. Every sacrifice, every loss, every moment of fear, because they had chosen love in a world that only knew power. And love, in the end, proved to be stronger. The Empire eventually rebuilt itself under new leadership. Mark managed to reunify the factions after years of war. He became a better, wiser leader, perhaps because he had witnessed what happens when humanity is completely lost. And sometimes, in difficult decisions, he thought of the former boss and wondered, what would he do now? And the answer always surprised him. He would choose what truly matters. As for her, the woman who had been invisible for so long, she never returned to the shadows. Not because she sought attention, but because she had finally learned that existing completely, being seen in her totality, was a right, not a danger. She wore colors now, laughed loudly, expressed opinions, looked people in the eyes. And when her daughter asked why her mother always said, "Never hide," she replied, "Because being alive means being seen. And being seen, my love, is the bravest thing we can do." And he, the man who had commanded an empire through fear, discovered that true strength was in allowing himself to be vulnerable. In every day he returned home and found his wife and daughter waiting, he understood. That was real power. The power to build, to love, to consciously choose what mattered. The Empire had demanded blood. He had given his own, not through death, but through the death of the man he had been. And in his place, someone better was born, someone human, someone free. It is not known what will remain standing at the end of all things, whether empires or men, whether power or love, whether fear or courage. But one truth remains, immutable as the tide. She never became invisible again. And he never forgot that being seen by those we love is the only victory worth achieving.